All right, let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And we're going to read all the way through verse 18. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? And are you not my workmanship in the Lord? And if to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. This is my defense to those who would examine me. Do we not have the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? Who tends a flock without getting some of the milk? Do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned? Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more? Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. But I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision, for I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting, for necessity is laid upon me, and woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward, but if not of my own will, I am still entrusted with a stewardship. What then is my reward? That in preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. Now, in chapters 8, 9, and 10, Paul's handling a question that arose in the church at Corinth about the spiritual ethics of eating meat that came from idol worship. And if we consume meat that came from an animal that was first presented to another deity in sacrifice, does that somehow compromise our loyalty to Jesus? Or does that become like a contaminating thing to our spiritual life? And there were some at Corinth who felt very, very confident in their conscience that it's just fine for them to be doing that. And in their true knowledge of God, they knew that an idol is nothing. That the deity that is depicted by this idol doesn't really exist in the way the worshiper imagines it to. And so if that idol is nothing, then the food offered to it is nothing, and it's nothing if we eat it. It's just a piece of meat. It's not like it became magically dark or spiritually dangerous because it was offered to a non-existent God. And they felt a boldness in that conviction to actually go up to the idol's temple itself and eat the food there and dine at the shrines to these other deities. And so in chapter 8, and again in chapter 10, Paul throws a red flag around what they're doing. In chapter 8, he wants them to see you're actually running the risk of bringing real spiritual harm to other Christians in the church family who are more vulnerable than you are to sort of getting re-entangled or re-involved in the idol worship that they left to follow Jesus. And if you take them along with you, or they feel emboldened by your example to follow you up to the idol temple to do that, well, when they eat that food, they eat it as a real act of idol worship. Right? That moment for them is so full of the old life that they left to follow Jesus that when they do it, when they eat that food, they do it with a conscious sense of that deity being with them in the eating of it, or that deity being honored in the eating of it, or that somehow that act is toward the deity. And so their conscience is defiled. And so Paul encourages them, stop putting your own indulgence at the center. Like, stop putting your own appetite at the center, and let's put love at the center. Let's put love for the weaker brother at the center, rather than exercising your so-called freedoms in Jesus in a way that trips somebody else up in their walk with Jesus and involves them in something that their conscience is convicted is wrong for them to be doing. Like, be willing in love to actually lay down your right to do something to look out for the spiritual good of another. That's chapter 8. Chapter 9 is a continuation of that conversation. Because in chapter 9, in the verses that I just read, the Apostle Paul takes them right into his own mindset in hopes that it becomes their mindset. Paul is using himself as an example of someone who is willing to lay down his right to something, to actually forego something that he might be biblically entitled to do in order to advance spiritual good in the lives of others. Something he has a right to in the will of God. He actually has a right to it, but he chooses not to use it in order to do what's best for the gospel. And so what I want to do is I want to kind of give you the grand conclusion first, and then let's go work back through the details that kind of build up to that conclusion. The grand conclusion from what I just read is that as an apostle, Paul has a right to take payment for preaching the gospel. But he waives that right when he deems it best for the gospel. So, as an apostle, he has a right of remuneration, but sometimes he waives that right when he deems it best for the gospel to do so. And I will let go of that if letting go of it means removing a stumbling block that might make it harder for someone to believe in Jesus, or might hinder the gospel going forward, or make it more challenging for someone to receive my disciple-making efforts in their life. So, that's the grand conclusion. Let's go walk through how he got to that conclusion. It's a lot. So let's start in verse 9, 1 and 2. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? And are you not my workmanship in the Lord? And if to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. So the first thing he does is he reminds them that he is really an apostle, a lead minister in the things of Jesus, and one who is operating in a unique role that carries authority in the churches of God. And he draws attention to his own eyewitness encounter with the risen Christ, which, by the way, is a criteria for even being called an apostle in the first place. And how Jesus, in that encounter, commissioned Paul directly to be a lead witness to the testimony of God among the Gentiles. And Paul says, hey, if others don't recognize me as such, at least you Corinthians are obliged to recognize me as such, because you, he says, are the seal of my apostleship. He's like, just look at your own transformed lives. Your own transformed lives are like proof of my apostleship. Right? The way Paul founded the church at Corinth, and how the Spirit of Jesus moved mightily through Paul to bring a lot of people to Christ and birth a whole new community of disciples there. That's like evidence of this special anointing he has on his life from God as an apostle. So he calls them the seal of his apostleship. Next, he then reminds them that he has a right to material support as an apostle. And he's using a series of rhetorical questions to do so in verses 3 through 6. This is my defense to those who would examine me. Do we not have the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? So he's reminding them, I'm a real apostle, and as a real apostle, I have a right to compensation in this work or material support. So he asks the question, do we not have a right to eat and drink? And the idea there is to eat and drink at the church's expense. To eat and drink as one financially maintained by those he ministers to, supported economically by the saints that he serves. And then he asks another question. And in that right, do we not have a right to take along a spouse? And the idea there is to expect enough support to cover a spouse's expense too. So to receive enough material assistance so that a wife could join us in the work, accompany us in those missionary journeys, and she would be maintained economically as well. So just enough to basically maintain the members of our household. And then the third question kind of builds on the last. Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? And what he means by working for a living is having to work other jobs to economically support ourselves. It's like other apostles are financially freed up by the churches they serve and the people they minister to be just fully given to that work. They don't have to go get other jobs. Don't we have a right to be financially supported and freed up to be given full time to this as well? Can we not make use of that right? Right? That's kind of what he's saying. And so now he's going to build, by the way, you guys at some level have done that for me, right? You bought a life, right? Like when you chose to bring on a pastor and put the pastor on a full-time payroll, you kind of bought a life to sort of be freed up to give himself fully to this work and not have to go work other jobs to economically maintain my household. Same idea there. And so now Paul's going to build kind of a very long case for why ministers of the gospel should be able to get their livelihood from the gospel. And the first thing he says is, this is what makes the world go around, right? I mean, payment for services rendered is what makes the world. I mean, that's just how society runs. Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? How many of you are in the oil field? Raise your hand. Anyone? Yeah. Chances are, if those paychecks dried up, you probably wouldn't still be in the oil field, would you, right? I mean, who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? Who tends a flock without getting some of the milk? So you got kind of three basic professions there that all come with this expectation of provision, that you get your living from your working. You're either supported for the work that you're doing, or you're receiving support from the very fruit of the work that you're serving, but no matter what, you're supported in the work that you're doing. And now he turns to the Bible for his second line of justification for why this is a reasonable expectation. Verse 8, do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned? Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope, and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? And if others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more? And so he says, let's go to the Bible. He says, we can see in the Bible from a passage in Deuteronomy where God lays down this principle of not muzzling the ox while it treads out the grain. You know, when it came time to separate the hard kernel of grain from the husk or the chaff, you would use an ox or a team of oxen, and you would tether them to a central pole, and then you would kind of lay out your fresh heads of grain or your stalks right on the threshing floor, and you'd run that around in a circle over and over and over again. And the ox would kind of beat out the grain and separate the grain from the chaff under its heavy hooves. Or that team of oxen would be pulling like a roller or some kind of instrument to sort of thresh that and separate that. Now, what do you think the ox wants to do while it's doing this sweaty work? It wants to take a swipe at some of that yummy grain that is helping separate. Keep its energy up. Stay encouraged in the work. It'd be kind of cruel to sort of muzzle the mouth of the ox so that it couldn't chew a little mouthful of some of the grain that it's thrashing out. And Paul says that principle is more about people than just oxen. And it does show up in a passage that has a lot to say about the fair treatment of people. That it's only fair that you get fed from the work that you're doing. It's only fair that an ox can share a mouthful of the grain that it helps separate. It's only fair that those who labor to get a harvest should be able to share in a little bounty of the harvest they're laboring to get. And so Paul asks, hey, is it wrong? Is it really wrong if we sowed spiritual things into your life that we would reap a little bit of material blessing back from you in that? We gave you the truths that changed your hearts and caused their hearts to be more generous with Jesus than they'd ever be without Jesus. And is it wrong if some of that flow of generosity that's coming out of you, a little bit of that come to us to maintain us in what we're doing? And so then Paul turns to another place in the Old Testament to add support to this argument. And that is the practice of the priesthood. Verse 13. Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? And it says, look at the very practice of the priesthood in the Old Testament. That God worked that very idea into it of getting your livelihood from the spiritual work you serve. Because different portions of what God offered to God, whether, went to the priest for their own maintenance, for their own livelihood. It wasn't all burned up on the altar. Some of the grain was for the priest's own consumption. Some of the meat was for the priest's own consumption. There was prescribed portions for the priest as payment from God, the God of the temple, to the personnel at the temple. And then the last argument Paul makes as he's building his case, this case of right of remuneration, right of compensation, comes from the very words of Jesus himself. Verse 14, in the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. So when Jesus sent out his disciples on mission 2 by 2, he instructed them to take no provisions for the journey, but to actually expect in faith to be supported by those they came to. To expect in faith to be provided for by those that receive them in. And he said, because the laborer is worthy of his wages, or the worker deserves his wages. So what you have there, guys, is just a big cartload of reasons for why it's reasonable for a minister of the gospel to expect material compensation for their service to the gospel. But that is completely compatible with the will of God. And yet, that's not Paul's main point. That's really not the main point. All of that is just a pit stop on the way to the main point that he's making. And the main point that he's making is right there in verse 12. Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right. That's his main point. But we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. And so Paul says, yes, we have this biblical right, but sometimes Paul chose to waive that right. And he would not make use of that entitlement when he believed it was advantageous to the gospel to do something. He would actually be willing to lay down what he was entitled to in order to let what's best for the gospel be his driving priority. And so that's what he's saying to the Corinthians. He wanted to make clear in that setting, in that context, that he's not in it for the money. that he's in it for the love of the game, wanted to make obvious in that setting the sincerity of his intentions. And if I can dip into a little bit of what he'll say in 2 Corinthians, sometimes he did it to make obvious that he was different than other false apostles that had come into the churches and were in it for the money and were operating out of ungodly motives, what Paul calls messengers of Satan masquerading as angels of light in 2 Corinthians. And sometimes Paul felt that he needed to set himself in contrast to those people that were in it for the money and were doing it for ungodly motives, and so he would choose not to take payment. It's just fascinating that Paul would move in and out of that right based on whatever context or setting he was in. There were other churches that Paul did take material support from. In fact, he'll tell the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians, I robbed other churches so that I could give the gospel free of charge to you guys. So it's not that he never made use of this right, but sometimes he deliberately waived this right when he saw that that was going to be a barrier to the gospel going forward, or that was going to be a barrier to people being able to accept the truth that he wanted to sow into their lives, and he would take a pass on that right. But here's the point. Let's not lose the plot. The plot is let's have a mindset. Let's have a mindset that's controlled by what's best for the gospel, not just me getting my preferences, me getting what I think I have a just claim to, me being able to do what I think I'm entitled to do, but to actually be willing to lay things down if that makes the difference between Jesus being magnified or seen or received or believed or not. Because what matters most is not that I get my way or that I get my preferences. What matters most is that people connect to Jesus. That's always what matters most. And among us, what matters most is that Christ magnifying, unifying love in the body occur. And if I've got to die to some preferences and I've got to die to some comforts in order for that to occur, then I'll die to those preferences and I'll die to those comforts. Right? That's how Paul thought. That's absolutely not how the Corinthians thought. And it's interesting that in waiving his right of remuneration sometimes, Paul found great reward with God. Look at how he puts it in verse 15 through 18. But I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision. For I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting. For necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I am still entrusted with a stewardship. What then is my reward? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. See, Paul didn't see himself as having sort of great personal reward with God just for going out and preaching the gospel, because he didn't freely choose that life for himself. It wasn't like he, on his own initiative, found his way into that because he just had a heart full of godly ambition and love for Jesus and wanting to do something big for the Savior. That's not his story, is it? His story is a story of alien abduction. Right? He's right in the middle of hunting Christians down, harming them, to stamp out the name of Jesus from the earth, and the resurrected Christ appears in overwhelming glory, with overpowering, blinding force, flattens him to the ground and says, "You are wrong, and you are working for me now." That's my summary. And so you can get up and go. So Paul's like, I didn't like volunteer for this. I got voluntold. I got like forcibly conscripted, right, into Jesus' labor force. And woe to me if I don't preach the gospel. Like, I think Paul understood he would be facing judgment some kind of judgment if he didn't. All right. So the best analogy I can think of, and for all of you Bible nerds out there, don't like press this analogy theologically to its extremity, because it will break down. But imagine like you were given to a life of crime. High stakes crime, high dollar crime. Feds have been after you for a long time. They finally got you. They finally caught up to you, and they got enough dirt on you to put you away for 10 lifetimes. But they said, you know what? We're going to make a deal with you. We'll keep you out of jail so that you don't have to rot in the hole for the rest of your life, but you're working for us now. You're ours. And we're going to take all of that criminal genius, all that criminal brilliance of yours, and we're now going to use it to actually help us solve crimes and catch criminals. Right? How do you respond? You don't say, well, thanks, fellas, that's really sweet of you, but I'd really like to pursue a career as a dental hygienist. Right? You don't say that. You kind of know it's this or the whole, right? And I realize that analogy breaks down, but I think Paul kind of saw himself like that, like preaching the gospel, just going out and preaching the gospel wasn't where there was room for reward, because he says necessity was laid upon me, right? It's like I didn't choose this for myself. This got chosen for me. And so where is there room for reward? Well, here's where there's room for heavenly reward. Here's where there's room for eternal reward, or what we might call laying up treasure in heaven, and that is offering the gospel free of charge. Because Jesus did not lay that obligation upon Paul. Paul actually had some discretionary margin on that one to freely choose or not choose. And so that became part of how Paul was gaining eternal rewards with the God that he served, laying up treasure in heaven, offering the gospel free of charge. So, concluding points. I got 2 of them. Number 1, when we freely lay down something to advance spiritual good in the life of another, or to advance Christ magnifying, unifying love in a church family, whether it's a comfort that we give up, a preference we die to, an entitlement we choose not to exercise. What are we doing? We are actually reenacting the story of the gospel. We are actually following Jesus in what Jesus first did for us. We're doing in a little way what Jesus did for us in a cosmic-sized way. Because in order for Jesus to descend down to us and deliver us, He had to set aside so much of what He was entitled to as the one who pre-existed in the very form of God, in order to take the form of a servant. As one who pre-existed at the top of the universal food chain, Jesus had a right to be served. And He said, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give His life a ransom for many. He had a right to be believed as the embodiment of absolute truth. And He came down here and chose to be doubted, knowing that would be the case. He had a right to live on in the body, because God says it's the soul that sins that has to die, and that the wages of sin is death, and Jesus had no sin of His own to die for. He is fully deserving of life, and He freely chose death and gave up that right. He had a right to be treated as the most worthy, important person on planet Earth, and He submitted to the mistreatment of others who abused Him like a piece of scum. He had a right to be worshipped and adored. He chose to be hated and to be ridiculed and to be slandered. He had a right to own things as the possessor of heaven and earth. And He chose to enter into a life of poverty, and He didn't even get to die with a shirt on His back. That's my point, is that this business of surrendering rights is what makes the gospel the gospel. There would be no salvation for you and I if Jesus came flexing His rights and unwilling to just lay down what He was justly entitled to. And so then that brings us to the question for us. And Pastor Garrett next Sunday is really going to help unpack this question more thoroughly with you guys. But it's the question of, what are we willing to lay down to advance spiritual good? What comforts am I willing to give up? What preferences am I willing to die to? What am I open to surrendering so that Jesus can shine through in a situation? And I can't answer that for you. Only you can answer that for you. I can give you some ideas or some for instances. It might be when someone chooses to downplay some of their own political preferences in order to establish a relationship with someone they want to share Jesus with. And they don't want those political preferences to interfere with their ability of connecting with the lost. And so they're willing to downplay those preferences that they're passionate about. Maybe it's a parent who's at the very peak of their career, right? And things have never been more successful. But your teenage child is going off the rails spiritually, going off the rails morally. And even though the environment you're in is perfect for you, it's not perfect for them. And so you choose to walk away and relocate your family. And you actually are willing to take lesser opportunities somewhere else so your son can get more of you when your son most needs you. Maybe it's you've worked hard all week and you've put in a lot of long hours and you have a right to spend the weekend the way you want to, but instead you choose to spend the weekend the way someone needs you to. And you lay aside your plans to make somebody else the priority. Maybe you have a right to press charges in a situation, but you realize, you know what, I can afford to absorb the costs of what they did to me more than they can afford to absorb the legal costs they're going to have to pay. And I see an opportunity to show some grace and then explain to them where true grace comes from. And you choose to waive that right. Maybe you have a right to tell somebody, I told you so, and you didn't listen to me. And this was the very thing I warned you about. But you realize, Jesus doesn't shine through me doing that or me gloating like that. But He will shine when I choose to weep with those who weep. And I just empathize with the pain of their decision and how they're going to pick up the shattered pieces of their life. Maybe because of your position in a family or your position in an organization or your position at a business, you have a right to expect others to be doing something that you should not have to be doing. And yet you maybe decide to lay down that right, to set an example, a pattern of humility for others to follow. Right? On and on this goes. But it's this mindset of let's be controlled by what's best for the gospel. Not me getting my way, not me having what I think I have a just claim to, not me pushing for what I think I'm entitled to, not making sure that my preferences rise to the top of this situation with someone else, but what's actually best for the gospel. And be willing to set that aside as one driven by that priority. And that's kind of what Paul's really trying to call the Corinthians to imitate him, because in imitating that, they're really not imitating him, they're imitating Christ.